Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much once again for the invitation, and thank you to all of you who are here through Zoom. It is great to be with you. I've noticed as people were introducing themselves that you come from all over the world, so I appreciate your coming. It is probably a difficult time of day for some of you to be present, but we appreciate, and I appreciate your willingness to be here and to spend some time thinking about academic publishing and writing. What I want to do today is to talk about three different habits that I think are important for writers to cultivate in connection with trying to pursue a publishing lifestyle. And so I'd like to put these habits into three short sentences. So the first is you become a writer by reading. You become a writer by reading. In a world where people read intermittently and superficially, Christian scholars need to read deeply and at length. And I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Second, you become a writer by writing. That may seem perfectly obvious, but it's important for us to remember that. Writing is a craft that has to be practiced, and writers should write all the time, both formally and informally. Whenever you have a moment in the midst of other responsibilities, you should be putting your thoughts down. You should be writing. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes as well. And then the third, you become a writer by publishing. You become a writer by publishing. Young scholars should look for opportunities to publish, and they should not be very picky about where they publish or on what fields. They should write widely and should readily accept invitations to write. So these three sentences encapsulate what I'm trying to say today. So now let me go back and talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. So first of all, you become a writer by reading. Recognize that because of the influence of technological advances that come from the West, we live in a new world today that merely pretends to read. People read half of an article on the web and they think they've read. They watch a video on the web and they think they've read. They listen to an audio recording of somebody else reading and they think they've read. This new world was created by the West, and of course it has many advantages, one of which is the ability for all of us to meet together from around the world today. But it also has some disadvantages, some drawbacks. I believe it has ruined people's attention spans and has exported what I might call a virtual illiteracy to the wider world. I distinctly remember in 1999 when I went back to the United States after spending a decade in Soviet Georgia, Ukraine, and then England. I discovered to my great surprise that while I was gone, and keep in mind this was 26 years ago, to my great surprise, while I was gone, Americans had forgotten how to read and how to think while I was in Europe. Now, brilliant American engineers and engineers from other countries as well have created invention after invention that caters to our illiteracy and our short attention spans, and thus makes them work. Unfortunately, the influence of that Western technological culture has exported this virtual illiteracy to other countries. Now, obviously, again, there are many great advantages of the technological improvements as well. But I want us to focus on the fact that people don't read anymore. They don't think anymore. They don't follow a long argument all the way through anymore. Christian leaders, Christian scholars, Christian writers need to read. Perhaps more than anything else, we need to read. We need to be the last people on the planet who still read long books all the way through. For the many of you who are Slavic, remember that Slavic culture, unlike Western culture, is a patient culture. It is a great reading and writing culture. It is a culture that can think of Anna Karenina as a short book. Don't let the impatience and superficiality of the West or its recent inventions that aggravate that impatience and superficiality sap your enthusiasm for reading. One of the most important things I think for Christian leaders today is to be able to follow an extended argument to completion, rather than just assembling sound bites or clips to support a particular point of view. Let me give you some examples. This is Augustine's City of God. This is Augustine's On the Trinity. Two of the most important and most influential books in all of Christian history. Almost nobody reads them all the way through anymore. Around 20 years ago, I decided that I would read these long books all the way through. I had read lots of them. I had probably read half of them in bits and pieces. But I told myself I'm going to read them straight through in order, all the way through. And that fundamentally altered my understanding of what Augustine is doing in his two greatest works. Most notably, perhaps, I began to realize that Augustine is not following the Augustinian model of the Trinity. Read books all the way through. Let me give you another example. 5 years ago, I decided to read the Acts of the Ecumenical Councils all the way through. There they are in English. You can see that's a lot. That's actually not very much of it. That's just what we have in English. This is all of it, and only for one council. This is only for the council in Ephesus. That's what we have in Greek and Latin. What I showed you before was what we had in English for all the ecumenical councils. I decided to read those councils all the way through in order, and it significantly changed my understanding of what the church was doing from 325 to 787 in those councils. And a great deal of my scholarly writing over the last several years and over the next several years is going to come out, or has come out and is going to come out of that decision. Let me read long works. Let me read them all the way through. So the most important bit of advice I want to give you is to read. Read in detail, read in depth, read at length. On the subject of reading, let me encourage you to organize your academic and scholarly notes. Develop a scheme that will enable you to find this particular thing that you're reading 30 years later when you need it. Remember, it's very easy to copy and paste notes into various different files in different places. Think now, if you haven't already, about developing a system that will enable you to find things when you need them again and again and again throughout your academic career. As you are taking notes when you read, take notes with the goal that you will be able to write without having to go back and look at the book itself again. Be thorough in your note-taking, and then learn to trust your notes. For example, in new writing, I will sometimes summarize secondary literature that I read 30 years ago without going back to look at the book or the article again. Just on the basis of my notes from 30 years ago, I can say something in a current article or a current book about that secondary literature. Could you do the same? Do you trust yourself to do the same? If you're earlier in your career, I encourage you to think now about writing your notes in such a way that you will be able to do that 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. Because you may not be able to put your hands on the physical book or the physical article or even the electronic version in the future. Read, take good notes, and learn to trust your notes when you will need them in the future. So my first advice is that you become a writer by reading, and in particular, being a scholarly writer involves the practice of reading, of following arguments, of summarizing arguments in your notes, of taking detailed and careful notes such that you will be able to come back to them in the future. You become a writer by reading. The second thing I'd like to talk about today is my sentence, you become a writer by writing. That, of course, ought to be obvious, but I've made an entire career out of stating the obvious, and this is one of the cases where I am doing so. You become a writer by writing. I encourage you to write down all of your ideas. Open a file on your phone for notes. Write down ideas wherever you are. Open a file on your computer. Fill a page with text as you're thinking about things. Over time, organize your ideas. Put current projects in one file. Decide when to devote time to them. Prioritize them. Put distant dreams in other files to come back to later. I actually have a file called Writing Wish List of things that I may never write. But if I get a chance to write, if I finish all the things that I have to write or should write, there's a wish list of things I'd like to write someday. So have files in which you put down your ideas, you manage your ideas, you change your ideas. Whenever you read something that relates to one of your ideas, connect it in your files. Now, let me mention that I am technologically very old-fashioned, and I do all of this just with Word files. That's surely not a good way to do it. And all of you who are younger probably are very well aware that there are excellent software packages to help you to organize notes and do all of that. Please don't be like me in that respect. Please utilize the new software packages and things that are available. Just don't tell me about them because I do it all the old-fashioned way. Take good notes. Organize your ideas. From time to time, assess your ideas. If you decide the idea is not any good, don't delete it. Just indicate on the file that it is not good and say why. Keep a written record of the development of your thinking, if only for yourself. Related to writing, one thing I encourage you to do is to keep all drafts of everything you write. Don't just overwrite a file as you revise it. Rename it draft 2, draft 3, draft 4, and write in the new file. You may need to go back to what you deleted when you revised. And unless you print everything out and work on paper, you can't do that unless you save the draft files. 50 years ago, writers would write on paper and they would keep everything. So they had a record of the changes of their thought if they need it. Now the temptation is not to do that. But I encourage you to be disciplined in changing the names of your files, saving files as new files in order to keep a record of the drafts of what you are writing, to keep a record of the way your thought is changing. When I was at university, one of my creative writing professors at Princeton told us that there are only about 4 or 5 born writers in the world. For the rest of us, writing is revision. Writing is practice. Writing is more craft than it is an art. It's something we have to practice, and we practice it by writing and keeping track of what we're writing. So I encourage you not only to read deeply, but also to write systematically, keeping track of the way you are changing your thought as you write. One other thing I'd like to say on the subject of writing is when you write, try to communicate, not to impress. Think carefully about the audience in each piece you write for publication and write for that audience. If what you're trying to do is impress scholars, don't pretend that you're writing for students or lay people. If you're writing for students or lay people, don't try to impress the scholars. Think about your audience. Think about how much of all the complexity of your subject that audience needs to hear in that piece. Try to convey your message to the various audiences who need to hear it. Try to communicate, not to impress. So you become a writer by reading. You become a writer by writing. And then third, you become a writer by publishing. So let me talk about this one for a few minutes. The first thing I would like to suggest here is that you want to think about writing at various different levels. And you want to seek opportunities to write at various different levels. In my own writing, I think about 4 different levels of writing: scholarly, academic, textbook level, and popular level. In my case, scholarly writing is writing that is aimed primarily at patristic scholars and seeks to break new ground in my field. I'm trying to tell other patristic scholars something that they don't know yet on the basis of my study. That's scholarly writing. Academic writing, in my case, the way I think about that is that I am trying to tell biblical scholars and theologians the things that the patristic scholars all know, but that the biblical scholars and the theologians also need to know. So I'm writing not for scholars in my own field, but for other scholars, other academics. I call that academic writing. The third level is textbook level, where I'm writing to students, seeking to summarize the results of my scholarship and that of other people at a level that's suitable for their courses, the modules that they're taking for their degrees. And then popular level. Popular level, of course, is where I'm trying to write to pastors and to lay people in order to show them the significance of the sorts of things that I am thinking about and that scholars in my field are thinking about. I suggest that you take as a starting point those 4 levels: scholarly, academic, textbook level, and popular, and think about, in your case, what exactly do those 4 words mean? What exactly is scholarly writing in your case, in the case of your own scholarship? How exactly is that different from academic writing in your case? And then textbook level and popular level are usually fairly self-explanatory. And then ask yourself, how can I contribute in writing on all 4 of these levels? Let me give you an example. In all of my teaching career, the course that I have taught the most is church history up to the time of the Reformation, the first of 2 church history courses that are often required in graduate theological curricula. And I began teaching that course in the year 2000. And by the year 2003, students were asking, why don't you write a church history book? Why don't you write a church history book? We like the way you're explaining this more than we like the way the textbook explains this. And for the first 10 years or so that I taught that course, I changed the book every year as I was looking for a good textbook. They kept asking me to write a book myself. And I said, that's not something you do at the beginning of your career. That's something you do at the end of your career. 15 years later, when Zondervan came to me and asked me to write a church history textbook, I said the same thing. I said, I'm 20 years too young to write something like this. They eventually talked me into it. And my church history textbook is this one, The Global Church, the First 8 Centuries, which was published 4 years ago in 2021. And the point that I'm making there is that as you write, and over the course of a publishing lifestyle that includes a long time, that goes over several decades of a career, you have different kinds of opportunities at different times. And you need to keep in mind the sort of progression that will follow, as you go through. Earlier in your career, you need to do a couple of things. First is you need to look for opportunities to publish your scholarship, very narrow, very deep, in appropriate places. Look for an opportunity to publish a revised version of your dissertation. Look for opportunities to write scholarly articles on the subject. When you are writing for scholars, you need to recognize that you have to show that you can be narrow and deep before you get the opportunity to write broadly, like in a book like this that covers 800 years of history. So at the scholarly level, you want to be looking for ways to write that are narrow, that are deep, that contribute in a small way to an academic discussion, a scholarly discussion about your field. But you also need to be thinking about other ways, other levels at which to talk about the same thing. One of the mistakes that scholars make is to think, I will write just the scholarship and then somebody else will talk about how it affects the church and how it affects the lay people and how it affects the students and the pastors. Let me suggest that if it's your specialty, there's nobody else in the world better able to make the shift from writing at scholarly level to writing at textbook level or popular level. If you can't talk about the implications of your ideas for the church and the world, why do you expect anybody else to be able to? So in response to the mistake, I call it a mistake, of just trying to write at scholarly level, look for opportunities to explain the significance of your scholarly ideas at other levels as well. So that's a mistake that some scholars make. But in a sense, it is a rare scholar who has the luxury of even considering the option of writing only for other scholars. Most of us, and probably most of you, are in a situation where we primarily need to teach, and we need to preach, and we need to speak to the church, and we need to speak to students. We're constantly working at what I call textbook level and popular level. And so the challenge for us is to try to also write at scholarly level. And so the mistake, this other mistake would be to think, I'm spending so much time doing this that I don't have time or opportunity or the need to write at scholarly level. And I would like to suggest that you try to resist that mistake as well. Look for opportunities to publish at scholarly level. Look also for opportunities to publish at popular level. Most of us will gravitate toward one or the other, and that's fine. But I suggest it's not a good thing if we're exclusively in one or the other. And so that's why I suggest that you think about your writing and your publishing in terms of 4 levels and try to write for all of those audiences over the course of your career. Let me give you another example from my own case. When I was doing my Ph.D. in Cambridge, and I began studying the church fathers, and I was amazed. And as I was amazed, I had 2 main thoughts. The first thought was, this is incredible. This is extraordinary. But the second thought was, if the patristic scholars know this, why do they not tell the church? And so at that point in the mid-1990s, I decided that I was never going to write just for scholars. I was going to write a book for the church, talking about the significance of what I was hearing the church fathers say. That book was not published until 15 years later, but that eventually became this book, Life in the Trinity, which is my most widely read book so far. As you think about a publishing lifestyle, as you publish, look for opportunities to write at scholarly level, at academic level, at textbook level, and at popular level, and work out in your own mind what those words mean in your case with respect to your own research and your own field. In terms of scholarly research, you need to think narrow and deep before you have the opportunity to be broad. My own scholarly research is on 5th-century Christology, and most of it is very particular, very deep, talking about the Christology of individual writers from the 5th century. Just in the last year, I was asked to write a scholarly treatment for Brill, 50,000 words long, about the broad sweep of patristic Christology. That was a great privilege. I was very privileged to be able to do that and very pleased to be asked to do that. It's not published yet, but it will be coming out in a couple of years. But it was not until I had been working in this field for 25 years that I was ever asked to write anything like that. At scholarly level, you need to be patient. You need to recognize that you need to go narrow and deep before you will get the opportunity to speak more broadly at scholarly level. There's one other thing that I would like to say about publishing, and that is that if you're a young scholar, you are likely to get a lot of invitations, or at least some invitations to publish, that don't fit your field very well. People know you, they know about you, they know that you have a Ph.D., and they say, oh, can you write about this for our magazine? Your tendency might be to say no to those. But let me encourage you earlier in your career, at least to think about saying yes as much as you can. For writing at popular level and even student level, I encourage you not to be too picky about the invitations you choose to accept. Appreciate invitations. Try to honor them as well as you can. As your career goes on, it is likely that the match between what you know the best and what you're asked to write upon will get closer. But early on, at popular level, you may need to write about a broad variety of topics, even though at scholarly level, at this phase in your career, you're being increasingly narrow. You're being narrow, not increasingly narrow, but you're being very narrow and deep. As I look back at the trajectory of my career, the popular and the textbook level writing and the scholarly writing have kind of moved in opposite directions. The scholarly writing went from being very specific and very detailed to being a little bit broader as I became well known. The popular writing went from being all over the map as people just asked me to write on random things to being more closely aligned with what I'm good at as people got better at choosing what they asked me to write about. So there's sort of a situation in which your publishing goes in different directions as your career goes on. The scholarly writing is very deep and becomes a little broader as you become more established. You get the privilege of speaking more broadly. Whereas the popular writing is more scattered at the beginning as people don't really know what to ask you to write about. But then as time goes on, they get better at matching their requests with what you're good at writing. So overall, I suggest you become a writer by reading first and foremost. You become a writer by writing, and you become a writer by publishing, which involves different kinds of publishing at different levels and also different kinds of publishing at different points in your career. So these are some lessons that I've learned as I've looked back over the 30 years or so of my academic and scholarly career. And I hope this is helpful, and I look forward to seeing the questions.